So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Victoria Sterling laughed as she poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena Vance's modest gray dress in front of the entire gala board. The deep red liquid bloomed across the cheap cotton like a spreading wound, cold and sticky against Elena's skin. The room, filled with the scent of expensive lilies and Victoria's cloying oud wood perfume, went deathly silent. "Oh, heavens," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a mock concern that didn't reach her glittering, predatory eyes. She didn't pull the bottle back until it was empty. "I suppose I thought you were a coat rack. You're so remarkably invisible, Elena. It's a talent, really." Marcus Sterling smirked from his wife's side, his fingers toyed with the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. He didn't offer a napkin. Instead, he leaned back in his velvet chair, looking at Elena as if she were a stain on the marble floor of the Sterling Foundation's private ballroom. "Careful, darling," he drawled. "That's probably the only dress she owns. You might have just doubled her net worth with that wine." A few of the junior board members chuckled nervously, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Clara, the head housekeeper standing near the catering entrance, gripped her tray so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at Elena with a mixture of pity and terror, but she didn't move. No one moved to help the woman who had spent the last 6 months as the Sterling's most diligent, silent assistant. Elena Vance didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even wipe the wine from her collar. She simply stood there, feeling the weight of the liquid soaking into her slip. To everyone in the room, she was a broken girl, a charity case they had hired out of pity. But beneath the surface, Elena's mind was moving with the cold, rhythmic precision of the forensic auditor she used to be. She wasn't looking at the ruined fabric. She was looking at the ledger Victoria had carelessly left open on the table to make room for her wine glass. "Well," Victoria snapped, her heels clicking sharply on the stone as she stepped closer. "Don't just stand there like a statue. Clean it up. The floor is getting wet and this marble is imported." Elena lowered her gaze, playing the part of the humiliated servant. "I'm sorry, Victoria, I'll get the cleaning kit." "Use your hands," Marcus added, his voice sharp. "And be quick about it. We have the auction starting in 10 minutes and I won't have the donors seeing a mess." As Elena knelt, the cold stone bit into her knees. She reached for a discarded linen napkin, but her eyes remained fixed on the ledger. There it was. A line item for event security, $2 million. She knew the actual cost was barely $50,000. She had spent months scrubbing floors and filing papers, waiting for Victoria to get comfortable enough to leave the books unguarded. Arrogance, Elena knew, was a far greater liability than debt. She felt a presence behind her. A pair of polished Oxfords appeared in her peripheral vision. Julian Vane, the billionaire investor known as the city's most dangerous fixer, stood just a few feet away. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't smirked. He was watching Elena with an intensity that made her skin prickle more than the cold wine. He saw the way her eyes tracked the numbers on the page even as she wiped the floor. He saw the steady set of her shoulders. "Victoria," Julian said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through the room's tension. "The auctioneer is waiting for your opening remarks. Perhaps you should focus on the guests instead of the upholstery." Victoria's posture shifted instantly. The bully vanished, replaced by the charming socialite. She smoothed her silk gown and flashed a brilliant, artificial smile at Julian. "Of course, Julian. You're right as always. Elena, finish up and then get to the back. You're an eyesore." Victoria and Marcus swept toward the stage, their laughter trailing behind them like a foul exhaust. The board members followed, eager to stay in the couple's orbit. Elena remained on the floor for a moment longer. She reached into the hidden pocket of her damp dress and felt the slim, cold rectangle of her burner phone. She didn't look up, but she knew Julian was still there. "You missed a spot," Julian said quietly. Elena looked up then, her eyes meeting his. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the submissive assistant slipped. Her gaze was sharp, lethal, and entirely devoid of the fear Victoria expected. "I never miss anything, Mr. Vane," she whispered. Julian's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. He didn't say another word, turning to follow the crowd toward the auction block. Elena stood up, the wet fabric of her dress clinging to her legs. She didn't go to the back. She walked toward the darkened hallway leading to the Foundation's server room. She had the numbers now. She had the witnesses. And most importantly, she had Victoria's absolute, blinding contempt. She pulled the phone from her pocket and tapped a single message to an encrypted number. The auction is live. Start the countdown. Victoria Sterling thought she had just humiliated a maid. She had no idea she had just handed the keys to her empire to the one person who knew exactly how to burn it down. Elena glanced back at the ballroom, where Victoria was currently basking in a spotlight that was about to become an interrogation lamp. The game hadn't just begun. It was already over. Victoria just hadn't felt the floor fall away yet. The next morning, the Sterling estate felt like a tomb of gilded secrets, the air heavy with the cloying, suffocating scent of Victoria's gardenia perfume. Elena Vance moved through the sun-drenched breakfast room with the practiced invisibility of a ghost. Her hands were steady as she set down the silver tray, but her mind was a whirlwind of balance sheets and offshore routing numbers. She had spent the last 3 hours of the night decoding the metadata she'd pulled from the Foundation's server, and the picture it painted was even uglier than she'd imagined. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, nursing a black coffee. She didn't look up as Elena poured the water. Across from her, Marcus Sterling was hunched over a tablet, his brow furrowed in a permanent state of agitated arrogance. "The auction was a disaster, Marcus," Victoria snapped, her voice like a serrated blade. "That little stunt with the wine made us look like amateurs. And Julian Vane didn't bid on a single high-ticket item. He just watched, like he was waiting for something to break." Marcus didn't look up. "He's a shark, Victoria. Sharks don't bite unless they smell blood. Maybe you should have spent less time humiliating the help and more time courting the donors." Victoria's grip tightened on her porcelain cup. She turned her venomous gaze toward Elena, who was silently adjusting the centerpiece. It wasn't a stunt. It was a correction. People like Elena need to be reminded of their place, or they start thinking they're part of the scenery. She leaned back, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Speaking of place, Elena, Marcus had a little accident in the study. A bottle of vintage ink. It's all over the Persian rug and some unimportant files. Get down there and scrub it. I want every drop gone before the Charity Oversight Board arrives for the pre-audit walkthrough on Friday." "Of course, ma'am," Elena replied, her voice a calm, flat lake. "And Elena," Victoria added, her tone dripping with mock concern, "don't bother with gloves. I want you to feel exactly how much that ink costs while you're digging it out of the fibers." The study smelled of old leather and the sharp, metallic tang of spilled ink. A dark, jagged stain spread across the white rug like a spreading cancer. Marcus had been careless. The unimportant files were scattered across the floor, partially soaked in the black fluid. Elena knelt. As she pressed a cloth into the mess, her eyes locked onto the letterhead of a document peeking out from the pile. Vanguard Holdings. Her pulse quickened. Before she was a maid, before she was a drowned rat in a wet dress, Elena had been the lead forensic auditor for the city's most prestigious firm. She had spent a decade hunting monsters who hid behind spreadsheets. She knew Vanguard Holdings. It wasn't a business. It was a laundromat. She reached out, her fingers staining black as she carefully peeled back a soaked page. It was a transfer log. Victoria wasn't just skimming the charity's gala funds. She was using Marcus's failing tech startups to wash the money before moving it into private accounts. The numbers were staggering. "Looking for something, Elena?" She didn't flinch. She slowly turned to see Clara, the head housekeeper, standing in the doorway. The older woman's face was a mask of weary caution. "Just cleaning the mess, Clara," Elena said, her thumb surreptitiously pressing against the corner of a document to steady it for a mental snapshot. Clara stepped into the room, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They think you're blind because you're quiet, but I've seen you looking at those ledgers when you think the halls are empty." She leaned in, her eyes darting toward the door. "Friday isn't just a walkthrough, it's the final filing. If those papers disappear into the shredder tonight, the trail goes cold forever. Elena stood up, the black ink staining her skin like a permanent mark of the war she was about to wage. They won't disappear, Clara. I've already seen enough. 10 minutes later, Elena stood in the shadows of the estate's rose garden, the cold morning air biting at her damp skin. She pulled a burner phone from the waistband of her apron and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. "It's me," she said when the line picked up. "I have the Vanguard logs. They're laundering through the Foundation's education initiative. I need the original audit trail for the 2021 fiscal year." "Elena," the voice on the other end was thick with disbelief. "Where have you been? We thought you disappeared after the Sterling case went cold." "I didn't disappear," Elena said, her eyes tracking Victoria Sterling as she appeared on the balcony above, looking down at the garden with the regal disdain of a queen who didn't realize her throne was made of matchsticks. "I went undercover. Tell Julian Vane the countdown is at 48 hours. By the time the oversight board sits down on Friday, Victoria won't be worried about ink stains on her rug. She'll be worried about the blood on her hands." She ended the call and tucked the phone away just as Victoria called out from above. "Elena, why are you idling? That rug isn't going to clean itself." Elena looked up, her expression perfectly blank, the sleeping lion behind her eyes finally beginning to roar. "I'm coming, Victoria. I was just admiring the view. It's a long way down from there, isn't it?" The following morning, the scent of expensive floor wax and desperation filled the corridors of the Sterling estate. Elena Vance moved through the shadows of the service hallway, her footsteps silent on the polished mahogany. In her pocket, the weight of a small, encrypted drive felt like a loaded weapon. She had spent half the night in the basement archives, cross-referencing the physical ledgers with the digital ghosts Julian Vane had pulled from the cloud. The puzzle wasn't just complete, it was devastating. She found Clara in the conservatory, obsessively dusting the leaves of a rare orchid. The older woman's hands were shaking, the soft clink of her wedding ring against the ceramic pot the only sound in the humid room. When she saw Elena, she nearly dropped her cloth. "He's looking for the ledger," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the automated misting system. "Marcus. He was in the library at 3 a.m, tearing through the floorboards. He knows something is missing." Elena stepped closer, her expression a mask of professional indifference for any hidden cameras. "Let him look. By the time he realizes the physical book was just the bait, the digital trail will already be at the district attorney's office. Did you get the recording?" Clara reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small, silver digital recorder. Her eyes were wide with a mix of terror and a strange, burgeoning hope. She admitted it. Victoria. She was laughing about the accounting errors in the Children's Wing Fund. She called the donors gullible sheep who deserved to be shorn. Elena took the device, the cold metal biting into her palm. "You've done well, Clara. Stay out of her sight today. The oversight board arrives in less than 24 hours. "Elena!" The voice crackled like a whip from the mezzanine above. Victoria Sterling stood at the railing, draped in a silk robe that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, but her eyes were sharp with a restless, predatory energy. She looked down at them with the casual disdain one might afford a pair of bothersome insects. "Why are you whispering in the dirt?" Victoria demanded, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "The silver for the pre-gala dinner hasn't even been touched. And you, Elena, I told you to steam the silk hangings in the ballroom. Do you need a diagram, or is your intellect as limited as your wardrobe?" Elena looked up, her gaze steady. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. "I was just finishing the orchids, Victoria. I'll start the hangings immediately." Victoria laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. She began to descend the spiral staircase, her movements fluid and arrogant. "You really are a curious creature, so quiet, so obedient. It's a pity you weren't born with a drop of ambition. You could have been a mediocre secretary somewhere instead of scrubbing floors for your betters." She stopped on the final step, leaning in close enough for Elena to smell the cloying, expensive scent of jasmine and entitlement. But then again, some people are simply born to be the backdrop of someone else's greatness. Don't forget your place again. "I won't," Elena said, her voice a calm, chilling low. "I know exactly where I stand." Victoria sneered, flicking a piece of lint off Elena's shoulder before turning toward the library. "Marcus, stop pacing like a caged animal and come look at these seating charts. If the oversight board isn't sufficiently impressed by the caviar selection, they might actually start asking questions about the audit." Marcus Sterling appeared in the library doorway, his face sallow and his tie loosened. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the rope to snap. He glanced at Elena, a flicker of suspicion crossing his features, but he was too weakened by his own cowardice to act on it. "The audit is fine, Victoria," he muttered, though his hands were shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. "I told you it's handled." "It had better be," she snapped, walking past him without a second glance. "I didn't build this empire to have it questioned by a group of bureaucrats in cheap suits." Elena watched them go, her fingers tightening around the recorder in her pocket. She waited until the heavy oak doors of the library swung shut before pulling out her phone. She sent a single encrypted text to Julian. "The weapon is secured. The architect is blind. 22 hours to impact." She moved toward the ballroom, the vast, empty space smelling of stale champagne and the impending rot of a dynasty. She climbed the ladder to the silk hangings, her mind already moving past the cleaning and into the logistics of the reveal. Every insult Victoria had hurled, every cent she had stolen from the children she claimed to protect, was a stone added to the wall of her own prison. As she pulled the steamer across the heavy fabric, the mist rising around her like a shroud, Elena felt the first true surge of the lion's roar. Victoria thought she was preparing a celebration of her own brilliance. She didn't realize she was merely decorating the room for her own execution. The countdown had moved from days to hours, and in the silence of the ballroom, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a countdown Victoria Sterling was too arrogant to hear. The morning of the gala's eve, the air in the Sterling manor tasted of ozone and expensive lilies. Elena Vance stood by the mahogany sideboard, her fingers moving in rhythmic circles as she polished the heavy silver tea service. The metal was cold, the scent of the polishing cream sharp, and clinical against the cloying cloud of tuberose perfume that signaled the antagonist's approach. Victoria Sterling swept into the dining room, the silk of her robe hissing against the parquet floor like a warning. She didn't look at the woman cleaning her silver. She looked through her, her reflection in the gilded wall mirror the only thing worthy of her attention. She adjusted a diamond stud in her ear, her expression one of bored, supreme confidence. "Julian Vane will be here in 3 hours for the final walkthrough," she said, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a woman who had never known a day of consequence. She flicked a microscopic speck of lint off her sleeve, then turned her gaze to the sideboard. "If there is so much as a fingerprint on that service, you'll be out on the street before the first guest arrives. Do you understand, or do I need to use smaller words for you?" Elena didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the silver, watching her own distorted reflection. "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice a low, steady hum. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers grazing the cool, hard edge of the digital drive she had secured the night before. It was a small weight, but in this house of cards, it was a wrecking ball. She looked up then, meeting the other woman's gaze in the mirror. For a fleeting second, the strategic predator behind the maid's mask peered out. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, the title feeling like a coin she was about to spend. "The charity audit is being finalized this afternoon. There's still a window to disclose the discrepancies. If you come forward now, Julian Vane might see it as a clerical error rather than a deliberate choice." The room went unnaturally still. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Victoria turned slowly, her lips curling into a sneer that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped closer, invading the space with the practiced intimidation of the elite. "Are you actually trying to give me advice? A forensic auditor who couldn't even keep her own career alive?" She laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "You are a ghost, Elena, a servant. You exist to buff my silver and stay out of the light. Marcus and I have built an empire that people like you can't even fathom. You think a few missing zeros on a spreadsheet can topple a sterling. She reached out, her manicured nail digging into the fabric of Elena's uniform shoulder. Know your place. You're not a lion, you're the dirt beneath its paws. If I hear another word about audits or discrepancies, I won't just fire you. I'll make sure you never find work as a dishwasher in this city. Victoria pulled away, her heels clicking a sharp, triumphant rhythm as she headed toward the door. She stopped at the threshold, not bothering to look back, and finished the ballroom curtains. I want them perfect for the reveal tomorrow night. Elena waited until the sound of the footsteps faded into the depths of the house. She pulled the drive from her pocket, the black plastic gleaming in the morning light. The mercy warning had been delivered, and, as expected, it had been trampled under the weight of an ego too large to see the cliff's edge. She moved toward the kitchen, where Clara was waiting by the service entrance. The older woman looked pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a stack of linens. She had seen the exchange. She had seen the audacity of the woman who thought she was untouchable. "She won't listen," Clara whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "I didn't expect her to," Elena said, her voice like settling stone. She felt a surge of cold, focused adrenaline. The countdown had moved past the stage of preparation. The evidence was locked. The witnesses were positioned. Marcus Sterling was in the study, likely trying to bridge the gap in his failing accounts with more of the charity's stolen blood, unaware that the architect of his ruin was standing 20 feet away. Julian Vane would arrive shortly, expecting a tour of a legacy. Instead, he would find the blueprints for an execution. Elena turned back to the silver, one final stroke of the cloth making the tray shine like a mirror. "Tomorrow night isn't just a gala, Clara," she said, her gaze fixed on the ballroom doors. "It's a funeral, and Victoria Sterling just picked out her own casket." The clock in the hall struck the hour. 20 hours remained. The lion wasn't just roaring, it was already in the room. The evening of the Sterling Foundation Gala arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to settle over the estate like a shroud. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, the air thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the expensive, metallic tang of top-shelf champagne. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured, amber light across the marble floors, making the entire room look like a gilded cage. Elena moved through the throng with the practiced invisibility of a ghost. In her crisp, black-and-white service uniform, she was merely a fixture of the architecture, a shadow that offered hors d'oeuvres and whisked away empty flutes. But beneath the stoic mask of a maid, her pulse beat with the steady, rhythmic precision of a detonator. She felt the weight of the small, encrypted drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her apron, a tiny piece of plastic that held the digital ghosts of every dollar Victoria had siphoned from the foundation. "Watch where you're going, girl," a voice snapped, sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the string quartet. Elena paused, her tray of caviar blinis steady as a rock. Victoria stood before her, a vision of stolen grace in a floor-length gown of emerald sequins that probably cost more than the average forensic auditor's annual salary. She was holding court with 3 high-profile donors, her eyes bright with the manic energy of someone who believed they were untouchable. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Elena said, her voice a low, melodic hum of submission. She kept her gaze fixed on the emerald hem of the woman's dress. Victoria didn't even look at her. She turned back to the donors, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "You'll have to excuse the help. It's so hard to find staff with any actual spatial awareness these days. It's like they're as hollow as the trays they carry." The donors chuckled, a polite, sycophantic sound that made the bile rise in Elena's throat. This was the first rage spike of the evening, the familiar sting of being treated like a subhuman tool. Victoria leaned in closer to a woman in diamonds, her perfume, a suffocating blend of black orchid and vanity, filling the air. "Honestly, I sometimes think they're just happy to be in the same air as us. It's the closest they'll ever get to a life of meaning." Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. She reached into her pocket, her fingertips brushing the cool metal of the drive. Enjoy the air while you can, she thought. Because in an hour, it's going to get very thin. Across the room, Marcus was hovering near the bar, his face a shade of frantic pale that even the dim lighting couldn't hide. He was clutching a glass of scotch like a life preserver, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds. He was waiting for the one man who could either save his failing business or bury it. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. Julian Vane entered the room not with a flourish, but with a quiet, gravitational pull that silenced the nearest conversations. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered of old money and absolute authority. His gaze swept the room, dismissive of the opulence, searching for something specific. When his eyes met Elena's for a fraction of a second, there was no sign of recognition, only a microscopic nod. The authority was in the house, and the stage was set. Elena moved toward the back of the room, near the audiovisual booth where Clara was stationed. The head housekeeper looked terrified, her hands trembling as she adjusted her headset. Elena caught her eye and gave her a steady, grounding look. Clara had the recording. She had the phone logs. All she needed was the signal. "She's going up in 5 minutes," Clara whispered, as Elena passed by to replace a stack of napkins. "She wants to do the big legacy speech before the auction starts." "Perfect," Elena murmured. "Make sure the feed is patched into the main monitors, not just the local speakers. I want the people in the overflow tents to see her face when the numbers change." As Elena circled back toward the center of the room, Victoria was already making her way toward the small, raised dais. She stopped Marcus along the way, hissing something into his ear that made him flinch. She adjusted his tie with a sharp, proprietary tug, then stepped onto the platform. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight found her, turning the emerald sequins into a blinding, shimmering armor. The room fell silent, the guests turning like sunflowers toward the sun of her arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow visionaries," Victoria began, her voice amplified and honeyed with false sincerity. "Tonight is not just about the sterling foundation. It is about the legacy we leave behind. It is about the lives we touch and the future we build with our own hands." Elena stood near the shadows of a velvet curtain, watching. She saw Julian Vane lean against a pillar, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He looked like a man watching a play he already knew the ending to. "We have raised millions for those less fortunate," Victoria continued, her hand over her heart. "And I have personally overseen every cent to ensure it goes exactly where it is needed most." The irony was so thick Elena could almost taste it, a bitter, metallic flavor on the back of her tongue. She looked at Marcus, who was staring at the floor, his knuckles white around his glass. He knew. He knew what was coming, even if he didn't know how. Elena reached into her apron one last time. She pulled out her phone, the screen dimmed to the lowest setting. She tapped a single icon, a command that would bridge the gap between the drive in Clara's hand and the projector behind the screen. Victoria threw her arms wide, a triumphant smile on her face. "So please join me in a toast to the sterling legacy, to the truth and to the future." She raised her glass high. The crowd followed suit, 100 crystal flutes catching the light. Elena's thumb hovered over the send button. She felt a surge of adrenaline so cold it was almost peaceful. The lion wasn't just in the room anymore. It was behind the curtain, and the curtain was about to fall. "Wait for it," Elena whispered to the empty air. The screen behind Victoria flickered, the Sterling Foundation logo stuttering for a heartbeat before being replaced by a stark, black-and-white spreadsheet. The first column was labeled, "Unauthorized Transfers." The room didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It simply went breathless, a collective vacuum of sound as the first few rows of donors began to read the names and the dates. Victoria, still smiling, still holding her glass aloft, hadn't turned around yet. She was still basking in the glow of the spotlight, unaware that the light was now reflecting off the evidence of her own ruin. Elena stepped out from the shadows, her tray empty, her head held high for the first time in months. The countdown had hit 0. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the gilded walls. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her hand still raised in a triumphant wave, though the applause had withered into a jagged, suffocating quiet. She finally turned, her silk gown swishing against the stage, and her eyes met the towering projection behind her. The transformation was instantaneous. The vibrant, polished mask of the philanthropist of the year didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The high, artificial color in her cheeks vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor that made her expensive foundation look like cracked plaster. Her mouth, usually set in a smirk of effortless superiority, fell open, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch. Her eyes widened until the whites showed all the way around the irises, darting frantically across the rows of numbers, the exact dates, the offshore account codes, the stolen millions. Her chest heaved, the diamond necklace at her throat catching the light in frantic, staccato flashes as her breathing turned into a series of shallow, audible gasps. She looked smaller, suddenly, as if the weight of the truth was physically crushing her spine. Her posture, once regal and commanding, wilted into a defensive hunch, her shoulders shaking under the weight of 1,000 accusing eyes. "There must be some mistake," Victoria croaked, her voice cracking like dry glass. She looked toward the front row, searching for an ally. Marcus Sterling was already standing, but he wasn't moving toward her. He was backing away, his face twisted in a mask of cowardice and dawning realization. His hands were raised as if to shield himself from the fallout of his own greed. Beside him, Julian Vane sat perfectly still, his sharp features carved from ice. He didn't look shocked. He looked disgusted, his gaze fixed on the spreadsheet that detailed exactly how his investments had been pillaged. 2 other board members were already on their phones, their urgent whispers cutting through the silence like scalpels. Clara, standing near the kitchen entrance, gripped her apron, her eyes bright with a justice long delayed as she watched the woman who had tormented her for years finally break. Elena Vance stepped into the circle of light at the base of the stage. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The simple black-and-white uniform she wore, the one Victoria had mocked as peasant rags, now felt like a judge's robe. The smell of expensive lilies and imported champagne in the room felt cloying, a funeral scent for a dying reputation. "The only mistake, Victoria, was assuming that the people you stepped on were too small to look up," Elena said. Her voice was low, resonant, and carried to the very back of the hall. "The Sterling Foundation didn't lose that money to market volatility. You funneled it into your husband's failing real estate ventures in the Caymans. I've spent the last 6 months as your shadow, documenting every cent you thought was invisible." "You're a maid," Victoria screamed, a desperate, ugly sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "You're a nobody, security. Get this woman out of here." No one moved. The 2 security guards at the doors stayed rooted to the spot, their eyes fixed on Julian Vane, who gave a single, imperceptible shake of his head. The power in the room had shifted so violently that the air felt thin, electric with the scent of ozone and the sound of a crumbling empire. Julian stood up, the rustle of his tailored suit sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness. "Actually, Victoria, she's the forensic auditor I hired to find the leak you swore didn't exist." He looked at the screen, then back at the woman on stage with a cold, final pity. "The police are waiting in the foyer. I suggest you don't make a scene. It would be unrefined." Victoria lunged toward the laptop on the podium, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She tripped on her hem, the sound of tearing silk ripping through the air like a scream. She scrambled, her manicured nails clawing at the wood, but the image remained, a digital tombstone for her career and her freedom. Elena watched her for a heartbeat, feeling nothing but a profound, cooling sense of closure. The weight she had carried since her own family's ruin seemed to evaporate, leaving her light and dangerously calm. "You told me once that I didn't belong in a room like this," Elena said, her voice a calm blade that sliced through Victoria's frantic sobbing. "You were right. I don't belong in a room full of thieves. Enjoy the spotlight, Victoria. It's the last one you'll ever have." Elena turned her back on the stage. She walked down the center aisle, her head held high, the sound of her sensible shoes steady and rhythmic against the marble. Behind her, the first murmurs of the crowd were rising into a roar of scandal, but she didn't look back. She had delivered the truth. Now she was going to walk out into the fresh night air, leaving the wreckage of the sterling name to burn in the light of its own vanity. The silence in the grand ballroom lasted exactly 4 seconds before it shattered into a cacophony of accusations and the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of camera shutters. Victoria Sterling stood frozen on the stage, the bright spotlight that had been her throne only moments ago now transformed into an interrogation lamp. The screen behind her still glowed with the undeniable proof of her crimes, the diverted charity funds, the offshore accounts, and the forged signatures that had built her empire on a foundation of theft. The mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Her skin took on the gray, translucent hue of wet parchment. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice, became glassy and unfocused, darting frantically toward the exits like a trapped animal. Her perfectly painted lips trembled, losing their shape as her jaw slackened in a silent, ugly gape. The confidence that had been her armor for a decade vanished, leaving behind a hollow, aging woman whose every breath came in jagged, audible hitches that rattled in her throat. She looked less like a CEO and more like a ghost haunted by its own sins. "This is a fabrication," she finally shrieked, her voice cracking and thin. She pointed a shaking finger at the empty aisle where the woman she had treated like a servant had just walked away. "That girl is a disgruntled employee, a liar. She's been stealing from me for months." "Enough, Victoria." The voice belonged to Julian Vane. He stepped out from the front row, his presence commanding an immediate, heavy silence. He didn't look angry, he looked disgusted, which was far worse. He held a tablet in his hand, his thumbs scrolling through the same documents that were still projected for the entire elite of the city to see. "The forensic audit has already been verified by my own team," he said, his voice a low, resonant bell that carried to every corner of the room. "The documents Elena Vance provided aren't just copies. They are the original digital trails you thought you'd deleted. I've spent the last hour cross-referencing them with the bank's live ledgers. There is no fabrication here, only a very long, very documented history of embezzlement." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. To Victoria's left, Marcus Sterling took a visible step back, his face a mask of panicked self-preservation. He looked at his wife as if she were a ticking bomb. "I had no idea," Marcus stammered, his voice loud enough for the nearby reporters to catch. "I was told the accounts were handled. I was a victim of her deception as much as anyone else." Victoria turned to her husband, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. "Marcus, you signed those papers. You knew we needed that capital for the resort project. I signed what you told me were tax returns," he barked, his cowardice on full display. He turned to the crowd, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence. "I will be cooperating fully with the authorities. This is a tragedy for the Sterling name, one I intend to rectify." The betrayal was the final blow. Victoria slumped against the mahogany podium, the wood creaking under her weight. The smell of the room had changed. The expensive floral arrangements now seemed cloying, masked by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone from the overheated projector and the cold sweat of a woman who knew her life was over. From the side of the stage, Clara stepped forward. The head housekeeper, who had spent 20 years enduring Victoria's sharp tongue and condescending demands, didn't look away. She held a small, silver recording device in her hand. "You called us faceless yesterday, Victoria," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "You said we were the background noise to your life, but the background noise has been listening and recording." Clara pressed a button. Victoria's own voice filled the ballroom, clear and arrogant. "The donors are idiots, Clara. They want to feel good about themselves. If I take 20% for the penthouse, they're still getting their tax write-off. It's a victimless crime." The face slap was metaphorical but visceral. The socialites who had been sipping Victoria's vintage champagne moments ago began to physically move away from her. The board members of the Sterling Group huddled in a tight circle near the bar, their faces grim as they reached for their phones to call legal counsel. The social hierarchy was rearranging itself in real time, and Victoria was being pushed to the very bottom. "Security," Julian said, not raising his voice. Two large men in dark suits who had been standing at the perimeter moved toward the stage. They weren't Victoria's personal detail. They were the venue's security, and they were following the orders of the man who actually held the power now. "You can't do this," she screamed as they reached the stairs. She tried to scramble back, her heel catching on the hem of her designer gown. There was a sickening rip of silk as she stumbled, falling to one knee on the hard stage. "Do you know who I am?" "I am Victoria Sterling." "You were," Julian replied coldly. "Now you're a defendant." As the guards hoisted her up, her hair, usually a perfect, frozen sculpture, fell in messy strands across her face. She looked at the crowd, searching for a single friendly face, a single ally. She found only cold stares and the glowing screens of hundreds of phones recording her disgrace for the morning news. The heavy velvet curtains began to close, but they weren't fast enough to hide the sight of the police entering through the rear doors. The blue and red lights from the cruisers outside flashed against the tall windows, casting a strobe-like glare over the wreckage of the evening. Victoria was led down the back steps, her wrists bound in plastic zip ties, a final indignity that stripped away the last of her carefully curated status. She was no longer the queen of the city. She was just another criminal being processed in the dark. Outside, the air was crisp and biting. Elena stood by the iron gates, watching the flashing lights from a distance. She felt a strange, cooling sensation in her chest, not joy, but a profound sense of equilibrium. The debt had been paid. The lion had finished its hunt. She turned away from the sirens, disappearing into the shadows of the park, leaving the Sterling Empire to burn in the light of its own vanity. 6 months had passed since the night the Sterling name became a cautionary tale whispered in the city's most exclusive backrooms. The headlines had long since moved on to newer scandals, but the wreckage of the Sterling Empire remained, a hollowed-out shell of a legacy that had been built on stolen ground. Elena Vance sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, a far cry from the cold, intimidating marble Victoria had favored. Her new office was perched high above the financial district, filled with the scent of fresh espresso and the quiet, rhythmic hum of a firm that operated on integrity rather than fear. She adjusted the cuff of her charcoal blazer, her fingers brushing against the simple silver watch that had belonged to her father. It was the only accessory she wore, a silent reminder of why she had stepped into the lion's den in the first place. A soft chime signaled the arrival of a guest. Julian Vane walked in, his gait as steady as ever, though he looked more relaxed than he had during the height of the investigation. He placed a thick manila folder on her desk, his expression unreadable. "The final liquidation is complete," Julian said, taking the seat across from her. "The last of the Sterling properties sold this morning. The proceeds have been diverted to the charity accounts Victoria drained. Every cent has been returned, Elena." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the figures. It was a clean sweep. Marcus Sterling had declared personal bankruptcy 3 weeks prior, fleeing to a small coastal town to avoid the creditors who were still circling the remains of his failed development projects. He was a man who had lived his life as an extension of his wife's shadow, and without her light, he had simply vanished into the gloom of his own mediocrity. "And Victoria?" Elena asked, her voice calm and devoid of the heat that had once fueled her. Julian sighed, leaning back. "She's in a state-mandated housing unit while she awaits the final sentencing on the embezzlement charges. I'm told she spends most of her time filing appeals that no lawyer will sign. She still hasn't quite grasped that the world she lived in doesn't exist for her anymore." Elena closed the folder. She thought of the woman who had once poured wine over her dress just to feel powerful. She thought of the sneer, the expensive perfume that had signaled Victoria's arrival like a toxic cloud, and the way she had treated human beings as disposable tools. 3 miles away, in a cramped apartment that smelled of stale air and industrial-grade floor wax, Victoria Sterling stared at her reflection in a cracked bathroom mirror. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed by the city's best stylists, was dull and uneven. She wore a faded sweatshirt she had bought from a thrift store, a garment she wouldn't have used to polish her shoes a year ago. Her phone, a cheap burner with a cracked screen, sat on the laminate counter. There were no invitations to galas, no frantic calls from board members. The silence was the heaviest thing she had ever carried. She looked at a crumpled newspaper on the floor where a small column mentioned the success of Vance Consulting. The image of Elena, looking poised and untouchable, stared back at her. Victoria felt a surge of the old rage, a heat that rose in her throat, but it had nowhere to go. She was a queen without a kingdom, a bully without a victim. She was, for the first time in her life, utterly irrelevant. Back in the high-rise office, Clara entered the room, carrying a tray of tea. The former housekeeper looked younger, the deep lines of stress that had once etched her face having smoothed away. Elena had ensured Clara was the first hire at the new firm, providing her with a salary and a pension that guaranteed she would never have to scrub a floor for an ungrateful hand again. "Thank you, Clara," Elena said, offering a genuine smile. "Of course, Elena," the woman replied, her eyes twinkling with a quiet pride. She paused at the door. "It's a good day to be a Vance." When the door closed, the room fell into a peaceful silence. Elena looked out at the city skyline, the lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. She had won. The debt was paid and the balance had been restored. But as she watched her own reflection in the glass, she saw the cost. She was no longer the invisible observer, the ghost in the machine. She was the one people looked to now. She had traded her anonymity for justice, and while the victory was sweet, it was also heavy. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a small, framed photograph of her father. She placed it on the corner of the desk, where the sun could hit it. The lion had finished its hunt, and while the scars of the battle remained, the territory was finally hers. Elena Vance stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the office, leaving the shadows of the Sterling era behind her forever.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.